Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm sure we'll have a few more trickling in here in the next minute or so. So before we officially get started, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping details and to introduce our speakers today. So today, myself, I'm Catherine Knepp, and then Joe Wisnowski and Josh Haney will be presenting today from Moat Casey and Associates. So welcome to the 2021 TSPN second year. We are excited to continue helping you all as you go through this next school year. As exciting as it already has been, I'm sure it will continue to be so, and we'll be here to help you out. Just for some housekeeping details, please drop your questions in the chat box. We will stop periodically throughout the course of the presentation to answer your questions. Also, in terms of questions, if you have some more specific questions that are related to something detailed for your school district, keep in mind we do have office hours this afternoon and tomorrow. If you'd like to sign up for those, please do so. We have access in the emails themselves that you got to access this webinar. So feel free to sign up for those as well and bring whatever staff you want. It's really sort of a work session. We won't be presenting any new material officially, but it's a good chance to talk to your colleagues and to talk to us about things that you need help on. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that we will be recording this and posting the video and the PDF later if you've had colleagues or friends in other districts that couldn't make it this morning. Also, there'll be an accountability presentation a little later, I believe at 1 o'clock this afternoon. And I think Josh just dropped in the chat box a link to sign up for the Moat Casey office hours. You might keep a little pad of paper handy just to write down any deadlines that you see throughout the presentation as just sort of a personal checklist of certain things that might be helpful, because there's a lot of things coming down the pike in the next 6 weeks, especially from TEA. So unless we have any other announcements from other hosts or panelists, we'll get started without further ado. Okay, so today's outline, you'll probably be used to seeing these 3 topics, but they are the ones that are most important to us as we continue throughout our work. So the first thing we'll talk about is the Foundation School Program update. Then we'll proceed to the state budget information, especially as we go through this bumpy economic timeline, and then federal funding update at the end to conclude for the day. So the first thing we wanted to talk about is that TEA is nearly complete with its near final summary of finance reports. There's been quite a few adjustments this year due to COVID-related changes, and there were a few more moving parts this year due to some House Bill 3 implementation pieces. So since the beginning of September, you've probably noticed a lot of different runs occur. Here's a breakdown of what those runs report. So if you saw drops or increases in the funding that you're expecting, you might check through these particular runs just to see if those match what your estimates are. So you don't panic if you see something change, especially when you see the ESSER ADA adjustment that happened there on September 14th. And then the tax information survey was the last thing that was updated. And in case you really are wanting to follow along with each one of those runs, TEA has published a workbook. You should be able to click once we post this PDF and access the workbook directly. It's on the state funding website, and it provides more information on how the agency made the COVID-19 ADA adjustment and the ESSER adjustment, so you can follow along with their math step by step through the summary of finance runs. And then here's a few other things to keep in mind, because like I said, in the next few weeks, here's what a few of those things you might write down on that pad of paper. A few other things to look for in the coming days and weeks. There was a very detailed TAA letter outlining those near final data elements that came out September 24th rather. Lots of details about the definitions of what each of those particular elements means. And then the second point there is that the CCMR outcomes bonus will be updated in October. So those of you who are tracking those particular details about where the cutoffs are, know that those are refreshed each year with new data, but that the cutoff points are stable. And then we've got college prep and industry-based certification reimbursements will be updated at final settle up. So if you're not seeing those yet on the summary of finances, don't panic, especially since the industry-based certification deadline was extended to November 2nd. So keep in mind, students did have to pass those exams in order for them to be reimbursed for those IBCs. And the college prep information, if you haven't reported that, you might take a look at that in the next week, a couple of weeks. And then 2019-20 INS calculations will be finalized in the next couple of weeks as well. And then in terms of your September payments and near final settle up payments should have been deposited last week. So just keep an eye on that in terms of your cash flow needs. And then again, one of these things that's coming up here pretty soon is the state funding compensation increases. It feels like quite a while ago that the Texas Legislature passed House Bill 3 with the requirement to provide this 30% compensation increase. And TEA has asked districts to complete a very detailed survey regarding these compensation increases given to staff for the 2019-20 school year. This is due October 9th. While it's not technically required that you report this information to TEA who then reports it to the Texas Legislature, this is probably the most expedient way to get it done. Otherwise, you'll have to report to the legislature personally in your own correspondence. So this seems to be probably the most efficient way to do it. The survey asked for funding estimates that you made last summer to determine House Bill 3 gain and the 30% amount. So, you know, you had to pay your teachers based upon what you thought would happen. They want you to provide that information, but then compliance will be determined later using actual 2019-20 COVID adjusted ADA. So remember back to that slide earlier where we had that run ID of 29015. Take a look at that because that's what you're going to be held accountable to, and actual reserves, the M&O state aid, plus your M&O collections net of recapture, and 95% of your ESSER grant. So if you look at that summary of finance, you'll be able to see each one of those three pieces. And then TEA's request to exclude the formula transition grant from this calculation was not approved by the Texas Legislature. So there's quite a few districts out there that have been receiving FTGs. So keep in mind that that is part of compliance, is that you include that, even though, you know, in distant years out, that won't be part of your funding package. And then charter facility funding should be included in the 30% calculation. So that's just a detail there to keep in mind for all you charter schools. Okay, Josh, do we want to answer that question that just came into the chat real fast, since it was about the FSP?
Let's see. So the question was, I have heard that we cannot include staff coded to federal funds in this 30%. Is that correct? I guess it would, the 30% calculation is based on your revenue gain. And I mean, that's how you calculate your obligation. But I guess that you're asking raises given to these staff. And I'm assuming it would not be from federal funds. Anita, would you mind clarifying, is the raise given out of federal funds or is it given out of local dollars? I believe it's coded to federal funds. Yeah, so I believe the requirement, and we'll do some research to double check this, but I believe the requirement is to have paid 30% of the gain that House Bill 3 represented for your district. And so I believe that would limit it to those dollars and not include any increases from federal funds, but we will double check that. And usually after these things, we send out a little Q&A document with specific answers, either pulled from TEA guidance or from TEA staff themselves. And so we'll get going on that, Anita, and make sure to get some a real clear answer for you. So thank you.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, I went back and was reminded that there's a pretty detailed FAQ on that compensation increase on the House Bill 3 landing page, which is now sort of buried on the TEA website since we've been paying so much attention to the COVID informations, but I know that there'll probably be some clarifying points in that we'll go and check, but you know, you may want to access as well. So. Okay, thanks, Anita. Moving on to teacher incentive allotment. So this is one of those House Bill 3 pieces that last year we were wondering about how exactly this would turn out. And now we have a first glimpse at what this is going to provide districts and the cost to the state. So we had cohort A during this past school year. And then we also had some additional schools that benefited from teacher incentive allotment funds. For this cohort A, there were 26 local education agencies included within that group. You'll see them here on this map, and it's about $40 million in TIA paid out to those particular LEAs. There were 3,926 teachers designated within that cohort. And then just within that cohort, here are the average allotments per designation category. So for your master teacher, the one that receives the highest designation is about $22,403. And then, you know, approaching $13,000 for exemplary, and about $6,500 for your recognized teacher. So remember, not all of those dollars are necessarily going straight to the teacher. It just depends on how the LEA chooses to mete out those funds, but 90% of those funds do have to be spent on the campus that the designated teacher instructs. So Dallas ISD received the largest allotment of over $29 million in TIA funds. And for these cohort districts, they did have to pay a fee per designation. So there are about $18.4 million in fees related to the approval of these designations that were reimbursed. If you are one of those districts that received TIA funds, there's a separate breakout report on your summary of finances that will report the number of teachers in each of the designation categories, the payout for each of those designation categories, as well as this reimbursement amount. Brownsville ISD had the largest average allotment per master exemplary and recognized teacher category. That was probably due to some combination of the number of teachers they designated, as well as whether or not they had rural campuses. And then remember, the TIA allotment is also based upon the economic disadvantage of the students that are on the campuses. So it follows the same data that your comp ed funding is reported. And then some participating districts had at least one master exemplary and recognized teacher, but not all did. Some just had recognized, some had master, some had master and recognized teachers. It definitely varied. And then there were some districts outside of cohort A, 17 others, that received allotments. There were 3 master teachers, 5 exemplary teachers, and 284 recognized teachers. When you see this 284 recognized teachers, that sort of severe disproportion in the number of master exemplary and then recognized teachers is likely due to the fact that a lot of these teachers must be nationally board certified because that particular designation automatically awards a teacher a recognized designation. Like I said, the bulk of those are likely teachers that had national board certifications and therefore earned that allotment for their districts or their LEAs. So just as a reminder, here's the cohort timeline. So we are pretty well through already some of this data capture timeline periods. So for cohort A and cohort B, the data has already been captured and the designation of system approval will occur here coming in the spring for cohort B. And then cohort C right now, even though we are doing a lot of remote learning and sort of different instruction due to COVID purposes, we're still moving forward with the data capture year in 2021 here. And then the funding flows thereafter. Districts with approved systems can choose to delay the start of funding, just depending on what makes sense for them. And then here's some of the mechanics of how this allotment is funded. So TIA funding will be recalculated annually in April based on the designated teachers' campuses of employment at the class roster winter submission in February. And the summary of financial report will be updated in September 2021, so this next year, as part of the settle up process. Districts will receive an annual report of designated teachers and scheduled allotment funds late in April 2021. So sort of late spring into the fall is when all of these things start to trickle out and reconcile themselves. For the first year of a teacher's designation or employment, the district must spend those funds by the end of that August 31st fiscal year prior to receipt of funds in the September 2021 settle up. Thereafter, the district will receive regular funding throughout the FSP based on projections in the previous year. So the first year is just a little bit different with an annual setup to account for new designations and or designated teachers entering and leaving the district. Because remember, if a teacher leaves, those funds follow the teacher. And so therefore part of that is the reason why we've got districts needing to spend those funds before the next school year begins. So accessing TIA funds, for those of you who, this was on the back burner just with so many changes because of House Bill 3, this feels a little intimidating. Maybe you signed up on your LOI to do a cohort D, but you still haven't quite figured that out. You might consider a way to access TIA funds in sort of the easiest way, which is to make sure that TEA recognizes whatever national board certified teachers you already employ. There's the $3,000 to $9,000 depending on the economic disadvantage of your students, as well as whether or not you have rural campuses within your bounds. And if you go to the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards on their website, there's a clickable link here in the online directory. You can see every teacher who chose to self-report who is nationally board certified. And so that person has already, if their certification is active, that can earn you money, and all you have to do is report that to TEA. So some of these teachers have already done the work for you by reporting this information. So I know that I personally went through all of the districts to sort of verify some of this TEA data, and there were quite a few districts out there that weren't receiving allotments that have nationally board certified teachers. So you might put that on your to-do list. And then for those of you who maybe are thinking, well, this is a great solution, maybe I don't really have the bandwidth right now to set up a designation system, but you can encourage teachers who are not already national board certified to become certified. And again, on that website, the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, they have monthly webinars for those who are interested in pursuing certification. And I know that Region 10 has created a comprehensive support approach for districts who are looking to have a cohort of teachers looking to be certified. Now, applications for this program, were due last week, but you might just look into sort of what their resources are for years to come in case you want to just sign up a batch of teachers to go through that program. And if your LEA is not currently developing a designation or otherwise engaged in the teacher incentive allotment program, at the absolute minimum, your teacher should ensure that your appropriate district personnel are notified of your district's annual allotment by submitting your TIA contacts through TEA's Qualtrics link that's linked there by middle of this week, September 30th. Because remember, as teachers come and go in your district, you may have teachers who have been designated in other areas that move into your district of employment, and you are responsible for sending out those funds in the proper way. So you need to be prepared for the possibility of employing a designated teacher and receiving funds through the teacher incentive allotment, whether or not you have a designation system, whether or not you choose to encourage teachers to pursue certification. Because remember, 90% of those funds must be spent on the campus where the designated teacher instructs. So it's important to have current contacts reported. That way you know that you've got teachers on your campus that are earning you funds that you need to spend responsibly. I see that Ms. Kelly Rowe, she's asked for a copy of the presentation. We will be posting a PDF of this with clickable links, as well as the final presentation itself. So thanks, Kelly. Continuing on with state funding, we've got some school finance changes. Again, we're in the middle of this COVID crisis, as well as House Bill 3, so a lot of things to keep up with. While House Bill 3 did not include any changes to the weights or basic allotment for this coming year, here's a few things that are coming down the pike. This is the first year that school districts will be impacted both by state and local tax compression. Many of you are acutely aware of this, having approved your tax rates. Districts can hold voter approval tax rates this year, where they were forbidden from doing so last year, unless they already had it as part of their school district plan. This year is the first year you can access ADZ funding. And then this is the last year of a more generous formula transition grant and final year to set the old law target. So remember, moving forward, we'll have just a couple of numbers that stay static that you reference back and forth for that FTG until it expires. And then we've got the Equalized Wealth Transition Grant sees a 20% reduction as that phases out over the next few years. And then we've got the 2021 COVID-19 ADA Hold Harmless, which we're going to go into more detail now. So given how erratic attendance will likely be during this school year, the agency has proposed 2 hold harmless provisions. The first one is that TA will replace ADA and FTE counts from the first 2 6-week attendance periods with certain projections if total ADA drops below a calculated target. So you should be keeping in mind those particular targets as you do your revenue estimates for this school year. And then remote attendance ADA will be funded through this first semester without an approved plan. Unapproved instructional plans will not be funded after that point. So come January, if you don't have a plan, and you won't get funding for those asynchronous learning students. So key takeaways, make sure you have reviewed that information, which we're going to go forward with here in the next few slides about the ADA Hold Harmless, and then make sure you have those asynchronous plans turned in by this week.
I guess just real quickly, we'll answer that question about the formula transition grant. So there's essentially 2 ways to get the transition grant. This year is the last way to get for some districts, a more generous grant. But the last year to get the grant, I believe, is 22-23 school year. And then it will expire the 23-24 school year. Joe, is that correct? We'll double check on that.
Yeah, Josh, I think it's actually 23-24 is the last year. 24-25 is the expiration.
Thank you. Okay, so the 23-24 school year would be the last that you can receive it. And then everyone will be, well, we'll see what happens, but the way the statute is now, everyone will be formula funded at that point. So,
yes, depending on what the Texas Legislature does coming this spring. Although with the economic situation that we have right now, that might be an easy thing for them to let slide. So, okay, we're going to go through the calculation of these ADA hold harmlesses. So if you haven't seen this yet, I'd encourage you to access this hold harmless target spreadsheet that TA has posted on their waivers, finance, and grants page. We're all really familiar with all those cards. So go on there and click on there and explore that spreadsheet. And you'll see that there are 3 different tabs Don't let that confuse you. The 2021 ADA and FTE hold harmless levels, those are where the specific FTE and ADA counts are posted for individual student count levels. So keep in mind, it's not just your overall refined ADA they could adjust, but each of those individual counts, like special ed, for example, all those different categories. Then there's a trend analysis, and then a ratio data calculation tab. So the hold harmless level is what is listed for your district in the 2021 ADA and FTE hold harmless level tab, that first one we were just looking at. So we're going to walk through a couple of examples here just to see how this operates. So here's a mythical district. They've got a hold harmless level of 24,103 in total ADA, and then 212 for mainstream ADA, and then 8,410 for bilingual ADA. And here is combined, or their average rather, of the first 2 6-week periods, 24,200 total ADA, 250 mainstream ADA, and 8,300 bilingual ADA. So what happens if these are their levels? So in this situation, the actual total average daily attendance is greater than the hold harmless level that's on that tab for the total ADA. So therefore, no hold harmless relief is provided, even though the bilingual ADA is less than what was put on the hold harmless level spreadsheet. And then here we've got another example. So here we've got 24,000 total ADA and 250 mainstream ADA and 8,300 bilingual ADA. The actual average daily attendance here is less than the hold harmless level. So as a result, the hold harmless relief is provided for both the total ADA and the bilingual ADA, but then you'll also notice that the mainstream is also reduced there. So even though their actual ADA is higher than the hold harmless level, it's either one or the other. It's not just increased for some and decreased for another. It's the whole thing. So don't forget that this hold harmless only applies to the first 2 attendance periods. Your final ADA will still incorporate unadjusted data from the 3rd through 6th period. So I know we've seen some districts produce in their templates, they've just put their hold harmless numbers in for the entire year, thinking this is the lowest it could possibly be, but that's not true. So you should keep in mind what's happening as the school year progresses. So TEA will also implement a cap on remote attendance this next school year. So if you've had robust attendance or even some new kiddos show up online, the aggregate attendance rate for synchronous or asynchronous attendance could not exceed the aggregate attendance rate for 2018-19. Now, if you're in person, that attendance is not subject to the cap, just for a remote attendance. We're not exactly sure what the definition is of this attendance rate. There's lots of different definitions, but just kind of keep that in mind if you've got a healthier attendance rate online than you typically do in person. And then on-campus instruction, just as a reminder, TEA guidance requires districts to offer on-campus instruction for all students, but there are some exceptions. So some of these you're really well familiar with, but the one we really wanted to talk most about is if a district elects to limit access during a transition period at the start of the school year, because TEA just released some changes to this. But I think one of the things we've gotten a lot of questions on that we wanted to highlight before we moved on to the changes is during these first 2 periods of transition, your district can go fully remote. If you look at that last bullet point, you can go fully remote in those first 4 weeks of instruction. But your paper packets, while they're fine for asynchronous instruction, do not satisfy the requirement. Students should have devices or hotspots, sort of one-to-one access, if you will, in order to kind of keep all students off of campus. If that's not the case, then those students do need to be provided the opportunity in those first 4 weeks to show up in person. Then during those additional 4 weeks, should your schools decide to do that, you've got the board approval, you and the state waiver, you cannot go fully remote if the district provides hotspots to all students. Some on-campus instruction must be provided each day, even though not on all campuses. So if you can adjust your attendance, your patterns of where students go to school to adjust for some of these changes and what your on-campus versus virtual instruction looks like and what works efficiently for your school district, but you do have to open your doors. And then this is the new piece. TEA announced last week that districts may seek a transition period longer than those 8 weeks by working directly with TEA on that. So you need to email waivers@tea.texas.gov in order to start that negotiation process. Any additional extension would require approval both from the agency and your school board. The extension request must include a plan for increasing on-campus access. And of course, for those of you who are in regions with higher hospitalization rates or who the governor's newest executive order kind of kept you at the lower capacity levels, TA will be taking special consideration for your particular situation when deciding whether or not to approve your transition period extensions. Okay, and so now that we have moved right along through quite a lot of those FSP changes and updates and guidance, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Joe, and he's going to give you the 411 on tax rate adoption.
Thanks, Catherine. We're going to start with looking a little bit closer at some of the other aspects of House Bill 3. Specifically now we're going to turn to tax rate adoption. Catherine sort of alluded to some of these changes earlier in one of her slides, but starting in 2021, you no longer have to have unanimous board approval to get that 5th enrichment penny. So you can do that without an election with simply the proper majority vote by the board. Districts receiving formula transition grant do need to watch out a little bit though. We've heard from TEA that they consider any additional revenue obtained from increased pennies to be a revenue that counts against the target for formula transition grant purposes. So if you're receiving formula transition grant, then you run some risk of needing to raise your tax rate enough to overcome that target in order to actually see some net additional revenue. Now, the same thing seems to apply to disaster pennies, which will become available for the COVID disaster starting in tax year 21, which is the 21-22 school year. So you can adopt those without an election if you have disaster expenses you're trying to cover, but if you're getting formula transition grant, be mindful of that interaction there. And sort of counterintuitively, the tax compression features of House Bill 3 really create a different dynamic than what we're accustomed to seeing. There's a stabilization, if you will, of state and local property values for districts that are growing faster than the statewide average. So if we could move on, Josh, there you go. In this slide, what we're trying to show you is some of the things that we've observed about tax compression over the course of the past year. As people have asked us questions, we wanted to talk about this from a structural standpoint. This slide shows you an aspect of how the stabilization occurs. What we've got is a school district whose values are growing at different rates. And you'll see that from 1920 to 2021, the MCR that's calculated corresponds to the growth rate of the district. The higher the growth rate, the lower the MCR until they reach the theoretical maximum rate or minimum rate, if you will. And what that does is it compresses the tier 1 or changes the tier 1 local share once it gets to the 4.01% level or greater. That local share kind of stabilizes, and you see that there's no change in the local share and therefore no change in state share for Tier 1. The state, had they maintained a 93-cent tax rate for the local share, would have seen increasing local share and realized a significant savings as property values grow. That savings doesn't really show up as a cost to the state in the traditional sense. It's just not going to increase the appropriation for Tier 1. It simply results in no decrease. Now, we've had for many years a relationship that was very different than that. Josh, why don't we go on to the next slide? We'll come back to this subject a little bit later. In terms of the tax compression that we've observed, about half the districts in the state received only the minimum compression. The other half went somewhere higher than the compression level of state average, so they have lower MCRs. 72 districts went to the maximum allowed compression, which is 90% of the highest MCR of the state, meaning they ended up with an MCR or Tier 1 tax rate of 82.47 cents. So we've got quite a variety of impacts throughout the state. What you can also see from the generalized impact is that we've got growth rates that anywhere from less than 10% negative growth all the way up to more than 15.6%. You see a distribution of school districts there. We've got about a little over half the districts fall into that band from 0 to 10% growth in tax base. That's about 56%. About 20% are exceeding the 10% level. Now, if we look at it from the standpoint of the tax base itself, it's really a much more concentrated distribution in the range of 0 to 10% growth. About 82% of the school districts fall into that band. Roughly 10% have negative growth, and roughly 9% exceed. I'm sorry, I said 82% of the districts. It's 82% of the tax base fits into that band. So roughly 10% negative and about 9% exceed the 10% growth level. So what we're going to see from year to year may change a bit, but at least for this current year, based on the MCR calculations and the tax value survey that TEA did, that's the kind of growth we're seeing statewide. When you look at it on a regional basis, this reduction in MCR from the 93 cents to the somewhat lesser rates isn't distributed uniformly across all districts. Regions 4, 10, and 13 saw the biggest reductions in the local fund assignment for Tier 1 in terms of dollars, but regions 12 and 15 actually showed higher percentage reductions, even though they have much smaller tax bases involved. Their percentage reductions were higher than the ones in 4 and 13 and 10.
I apologize. That should be million, not billion at the bottom there. Yeah, the total state cost at $890.
Yeah, I hadn't caught that either, Josh.
Yeah,
thanks.
My apologies.
So what's the impact of the tax compression scheme on state funding and state appropriations? That's really an emerging issue that we wanted to focus a little bit more on. The impact isn't really identified in the fiscal note for House Bill 3. Fiscal note is the Legislative Budget Board's attempt to say this is what this legislation is going to cost. It did identify that there's a reduction expected of about $2.7 billion in property taxes for the biennium, but that's sort of the net effect of lower rates and rising values. Now, the other changes in House Bill 3, the basic allotment change, the shift to current year values, all those things make it pretty ambiguous what this new structural approach to reducing tax rates is going to mean in the state. For 2021, we know that growth between about 4% and 15% results in a fixed local share of Tier 1 for those districts in that zone. And growth in value isn't going to have the same implication that it's had to school district or to the state funding system for really 3+ decades. So the cost to the state is going to be the lack of recognition of the savings it would otherwise have experienced. And that's going to have an appropriation consequence that is much more subtle than just a dollar amount identified in the fiscal note. Now, we at Mulcahy have tried to calculate the impact of tax compression in the House Bill 3 world in isolation. Now, this is somewhat crude. It's not an exact science because we obviously don't know what value growth is going to be for tax years 21 and 22. But we can easily identify what a 7-cent reduction, which is a generalization of what happened to Tier 1 in 1920. We know what that's going to cost. It's a little over $2 billion a year going forward as values grow in terms of local share that the state essentially gave up as part of the House Bill 3 mechanism. And when we look at the value growth of 2021, we are seeing, again, about a $900 million increase in cost to the state because that growth doesn't count for increasing the local share and reducing state aid. That continues on, or if we assume it continues on at the same rates that it occurred for 2021 in terms of lowering NCRs and shifting that cost to the state rather than the local side, we can see how the net cost of the state is going to go up from one biennium to the next by roughly $4 billion. The way that the state looks at budgeting and appropriations is on a biennium to biennium basis, generally speaking. You can see here it's going from 2 billion to almost 3 billion to almost 4 billion to almost 5 billion. When you compare the 2 years of the current biennium to these forecasts, you're looking at an additional $4 billion cost to the foundation school program from that factor alone. And that doesn't count growth in students and other things that the state would normally fund as part of the overall structure of funding the foundation school program. Now, with this floating local share concept, we're going to have some different implications when you look at the trend lines for the foundation school program. And this is even less exact in terms of this approach, but what we've had for the past decade or so is an average growth rate in the total state and local funds for the foundation school program of a little over 4.5% per year. Local property values have, and the local tax revenue as a result of that, has tended to grow at about almost 6%, about 5.8%. You can notice there in 1920 a shift, and that's the result of House Bill 3, where it depressed property tax revenue and increased state appropriations. But the trends overall have been roughly stable. And so we just extended those trends out, and you can see how under the solid line, the normal circumstances, state costs wouldn't rise very much. The local share would continue to increase, and as would the foundation school program. What this continuing compression, automatic compression scheme does is that it changes that relationship. It's going to mean a need for much higher state appropriations if local tax revenue is not going to grow as much. We put a limitation here of 3% on local tax revenue. You'll recall that the MCR calculation uses a kind of a 2.5% minimum. But remember that, aside from that 2.5% allowable growth, there's not much more that districts would get unless they exceed 15% growth, roughly, at least in the most recent calculations. So we just use 3% as an approximation. What we see towards the end of a decade is an additional annual requirement in excess of $14 billion. And that becomes a real significant state budget issue. So let's now turn our attention to state finances. If you want to move on, Josh, there you go. Now, you'll all recall that back in July, the controller reduced the forecast for the current biennium's revenues by about $11.6 billion, and that led to a calculated deficit position for the state's budget of about $4.6 billion by the end of the biennium. Now, the legislature has many mechanisms it's going to use to close that gap for the current biennium, but it does raise a significant question about how soon will things recover. Controller does not think the recovery is going to be very rapid. As you can see on the next slide, we've got sales tax, the state's largest tax source, at a lower level for the past several months once the COVID epidemic hit than in the previous year, with the exception of July. There were some unusual circumstances for July that led to that. So we're running behind on sales tax collections compared to the prior year. And severance taxes are in a much worse position. You can see a decline that has been very precipitous, that wasn't really caused by the pandemic as such, but just happened at about the same time. That's a significant concern as well. And when you look at the overall state tax structure, everything is lower than it was the preceding year. Now, the controller, having revised the revenue forecast, actually several categories of revenue ended up beating the most recent revised forecast. But it really is just more an indicator of how unstable the circumstances are and how difficult it is to predict what's happening with revenues. A long extended recovery is going to mean a real problem for funding tax compression, along with just general state budget issues for next biennium. Now, the legislature was aware that this was going to be something of a financing issue in the future, so they directed the Legislative Budget Board to study the funding implications in the context of various revenue alternatives. A significant share of what the LBB ended up reporting examines the current state tax structure and how that structure compares to other states. It then looks about different aspects of making changes to the state's tax structure. They provided several considerations for taxation. It points out that you would want to have the administrative cost for tax collection for any kind of changes to be low relative to the revenue you're going to receive, because you don't want to spend a high percentage of additional revenue on just administering the tax. It also states that revenue volatility has to be a consideration. As we've just seen, just about everything has been volatile for the past several months, as well as the efficiency of the tax and its equity. I would argue that there's an unstated consideration that any revenue source the legislature intends to use to fund tax compression should be one that grows at about the rate of growth of state property values. In fact, a little bit higher than that. You'll recall that the minimum amount of tax compression is driven by that projected state average. We did have some districts who had declining property values, but their taxes were compressed to 9164 for Tier 1 purposes. Essentially, half the districts are growing at a rate faster than average, and they get even more compression. So you need a tax source, if you're going to fund this, that grows at least at the average of state property taxes, and probably at a rate higher than that. Now, with respect to volatility, we'll focus on that for just a second. Here's a chart or table that the LBB included in their report showing the relative volatility, which they measure as a standard deviation in the annual growth rate of the various tax sources. You'll note that the most volatile sources are natural gas and oil production taxes. We've seen that go up and down over the decades. Sales tax is about as volatile as property taxes. It doesn't grow quite at the same rate, and they both are fairly aligned to the gross state product. So you kind of get the sense that sales tax might be a reasonable replacement for school property taxes. But we already have a fairly high sales tax, which covers a lot of things. So that's an issue that needs to be dealt with in the legislature. Some other taxes like cigarette and tobacco taxes are declining. You wouldn't want to pick that. The alcoholic beverage taxes, well, they are stable and are growing, but you can only get so much money from alcoholic beverage taxes before it starts to have an impact on consumption, you would think. If we move now to efficiency, this is a measure that the LBB used in their study to say, if we raise this tax by enough to cover a 1 penny reduction in property taxes, how much will we lose in gross state product from people changing their behaviors, not having that money available to spend on other things, or just avoiding the tax by not consuming whatever it is? You can see that the most efficient taxes are natural gas and oil production. In large part, state level gross state product is impacted almost negligibly by those two taxes, because a lot of that is related to tax that's exported to consumers that are out of state. So there's very little impact there. On the other hand, if you're trying to raise money from sales tax, it has a fairly substantial impact on the gross state product, as does motor vehicle taxes and franchise taxes. It's higher than the average of all state taxes. Now, if we look at the equity of the tax, and by this, the Legislative Budget Board had a couple of different measures. Its impact on initial consumers versus its impact on those with lower incomes, the regressivity index that's in the last column of these tables. What you see is oil and gas production taxes are not very aggressive. They don't hit low incomes very much. They don't hit initial consumers at all because it's a production tax. This is before the product actually gets refined and available to purchase in terms of gasoline or diesel, or gets shipped to the ultimate consumers in terms of natural gas. A lot of those taxes are exported because those mineral resources get distributed throughout the nation. So it doesn't really have a big impact on lower income Texans, so it has a very low regressivity index. Property taxes, on the other hand, almost half of them go to the initial consumers. This is through our own property taxes on homes and businesses. About 20% can be exported because a lot of business property is owned by out-of-state owners, and so it can get exported through that mechanism. It has a relatively low regressivity index, meaning it doesn't hit low incomes a lot harder than it does higher incomes. When you look at sales tax, it has similar characteristics in terms of hitting initial consumers and the percent that is exported to other states, but its regressivity index is higher, meaning it's going to have a bigger impact on lower income folks. Those are all considerations in terms of what tax the state should focus on. So where does this leave us? What we see is that continuing automatic tax rate reduction driven by property value growth will be an unavoidable additional expense to the state down the road, and a large one that the current revenue stream likely can't cover, even without a recession. Property tax rate reduction is likely going to suck a lot of the oxygen out of the room when it comes to talking about the state's budgetary discretion, and that without a rapid and strong recovery, it's going to make it even harder for the legislature to deal with this problem next session. Making reasonable assumptions about rising state costs for property tax rate reductions is likely going to lead to additional appropriation requirement of double-digit billions within just a decade. And that raises some serious questions about the sustainability of this structural change without major changes in state tax structure. That's a difficult subject, and the legislature is going to have to grapple with that almost immediately because of the impact of the pandemic. So it's one of the bigger issues that's kind of lurking in the background of a legislative session that's going to be more complex than most in the coming months. With that, such a bright note, I'll turn it over to Josh, who's going to cover some federal fund issues.
Thank you, Joe. And I think real quickly, we wanted to touch on some comments that we found a little interesting. I don't know, for the folks that attended the Texas Tribune Festival, I know we're all really busy, so we'll probably weren't able to catch that, but we were kind of surprised at the focus on school districts' rainy day funds. So this is a quote from Senator Larry Taylor. He's the chair of the Senate Ed Committee. He says, our districts have a lot of reserve. We talk about the rainy day fund at the state level. School districts have multiple of what we have. And then right after that, his colleague over on the House side, Chairman Huberty, sort of chimed in and continued the thought, saying that you got schools that didn't open from March through half of September. There's been significant savings there. So in case you guys didn't know it, that shutdown period where you guys had to scramble to buy technology and sanitization for your buildings, all that, you should have somehow noticed some significant savings there as well. So just drop in the chat how much money you saved during that time. We'll be interested to see that. But Huberty's quote continuing on here was, if taxpayers actually knew how much money school districts had in their fund balances, they'd be alarmed. We know it is 15 billion. We think it is higher than that right now. That's double than what the state of Texas has. So, and we've seen this, and Joe can probably speak to this as well, but we've seen this focus on fund balances from the legislature from time to time. But we were kind of surprised that it was coming from two voices that should possibly know what their, how school districts use them and sort of what they're designed for. Joe, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I just add, I'm sorry, I forgot about these slides, Josh. The only thing I would add is the concept of school district fund balances being a rainy day fund needs to be dispelled as broadly as it can possibly be. The undedicated fund balances are essentially part of your checking account balance. It does not mean it's a rainy day fund. The state's rainy day fund takes a special effort to appropriate money from it. It is truly a rainy day fund because of the high level of vote that's needed. It takes a 2/3 majority in each chamber, if I remember correctly, to appropriate money from the state's rainy day fund. A school district fund balance, particularly the undedicated, unreserved amounts, is simply that. It's a balance that exists at a point in time. It doesn't mean that that's there all throughout the year. It's like your checking account balance on a personal level. It floats up and down based on your inflows and outflows. And so this concept that how it's measured at the end of a fiscal year is somehow indicating that you have a rainy day fund. Well, parts of it may be saved up for particular purposes. Parts of it may be reserved for purposes, but the part that they're talking about, they're treating as if it isn't used for anything when it's really part of your cash flow structure. So whatever you can do in talking to your board and having them talk to legislators to dispel this notion that you have huge amounts of money stocked up as just waiting to be used to fund schools, that really needs to be, I think, a priority this time around because of the dire condition the state's going to be in. Josh, back to you.
Thank you, Joe. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up real quickly with a short federal funding update. And again, here's just a recap of the CARES Act. We all kind of know what these acronyms mean by now, but just for those that don't, the CARES Act was a $2 trillion package, and it includes three main sort of education-specific programs: the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. Texas received $307 million out of that. Of course, ESSER, we all know and love that. Texas got $1.3 billion from that fund. And then there was a separate pot of money for the higher education emergency relief fund. Sort of outside of those three education-specific programs was the coronavirus relief fund. And Governor Abbott received $6.2 billion from that. And of course, some of that has been used to fund things like Operation Connectivity, and we'll touch on that here in a minute. But I just kind of wanted to go through and just give a big picture overview of how those funds have been spent so far and kind of what other pots of money are still out there. So I'll start off with ESSER. We all kind of are aware of the story on that, of course. $1.2 billion was used to supplant state FSP dollars. We all see the results of that on our summary of finance reports that Catherine mentioned at the start of the presentation. And then under federal statute, TEA is allowed to skim a little bit of ESSER for discretionary purposes. We're not aware right now what their plan for that is. It could be to potentially offset some of the cuts that they saw for the current biennium. But I haven't seen a public sort of listing of what their plans are for that. I guess while we're on ESSER, I'll go ahead and address this question. When should when should we receive the final NOCA for ESSER? Yeah, when should we see it? Yeah, you know, I'm not sure what that timeline is. I have to go check. I know you should get, I think, like that first 20% within X amount of days after you apply. But in terms of the timeline for the final, yeah, okay, so they got the first 20. We'll go double check that, and we'll make sure to include that in our Q&A document that goes out after this presentation. Just to be perfectly honest, ESSER seems like a lifetime ago when we were answering questions on that. We've been kind of swamped with those coronavirus relief fund questions. And so we'll have to go and brush up on our ESSER timelines. So apologies for that, but we'll go track down that answer for you. That next pot of money that I'll touch on was the governor's emergency education relief fund. And again, Texas got $307 million from that. You may have seen headlines that Governor Abbott used around $175 million for higher education financial aid support. And then he used a little bit, $3 million there to maintain educational services at the School for the Blind and Deaf and Wyndham schools. But still under that, as far as we're aware, $130 million have not been allocated. There's been no sort of public plan announced for that yet. So there is still a little bit of money there. And then there's a whole lot of money over on the coronavirus relief fund. So like I mentioned earlier, the state got, or Governor Abbott got rather, $6.2 billion out of that fund. So far, we've used $400 million for the CRF reimbursement program. We dedicated $200 million to Operation Connectivity. They threw $15 million at the census to sort of boost the count for that. But that leaves $5.6 billion that have not been allocated, or we haven't seen a plan sort of announced for those yet. And so, you know, fingers crossed, we're hoping that means a reimbursement program that looks at expenses after May 20th, but we'll have to see. I think we have heard that discussions about that are ongoing, but it's sort of rumor right now, and there's not, we haven't seen anything official or, you know, anything sort of outlining what that program could look like. And then I just wanted to remind you of a couple of deadlines on those coronavirus relief fund programs. The program handled by TDEM, of course, I hope you guys are pretty well along on identifying those eligible expenses and documenting them. And if you're not, get off this webinar right now and go get started on that, because that's due on the 30th. I will say TDEM posted an FAQ and it's linked there. That was a new FAQ posted on the 15th that it has a little bit of new information. The main bit of news there was how they treated hazard pay. I know several districts that we work with were sort of planning on submitting quite a bit of hazard pay under this program, but TDEM sort of said that it would only be reimbursed in rare cases for LEAs, and they kind of walked through some of those situations in that FAQ. So if that's something you were interested in hoping to get reimbursed, be sure to go check out that FAQ and make sure that your particular cases apply to what they lay out there.
Yeah, and use the link that's in our presentation, because I know TEA had posted a FAQ on its website that was actually linking to information regarding counties and cities, which was a little misleading. So
yes, yeah, thank you for that. Let's see. Okay, a question about, so the TDEM reimbursement is not related to, looking at the question, is TDEM reimbursement for LEAs that participate with city and county reimbursement program. So that's operation connectivity that you're talking about, and that's on the next slide. So I'm gonna set that aside for now. But for the TDEM portion, that's the 25-75% split that you get 75% of your eligible costs reimbursed, and that's for those costs between March and May 20th. And so it's looking at primarily technological expenses, but also if there's some payroll that those responsibilities were substantially reassigned. I forget the exact term that's in the FAQ, but if you had, for example, a front office staff that back in March had to quickly switch over to stuffing paper packets. Clearly that wasn't in their normal job description. And so that's an example of payroll that could be reimbursed under this program. And then of course, if you bought any technology, hotspots, retrofitted buses with hotspots, that kind of thing, that could be something that's eligible for reimbursement under this program. And so let's see. Yeah, okay. And then also I mentioned Operation Connectivity. So that comes out of the Coronavirus Relief Fund pot of money from the feds, but it is its own separate program. And so y'all are familiar most likely with the bulk purchase part of that program that was handled by Region 4. For districts that participated in that bulk purchase program, you now have the option or the ability to draw down additional funds from TEA and your local partners. If you get your local partners to kick in some, TEA will match that local contribution. And so I've heard some districts that are successful in essentially getting their entire bulk purchase order funded either from TEA or their local, in combination with their local city or county. And so this is something that districts should definitely look into. There's a little flyer and FAQ on the Coronavirus Relief Fund site, on a portion of TEA's site. And if you have questions about that, feel free to shoot us an email. We can kind of point you to those resources more directly. But I just want to make sure everyone is aware that that deadline is coming up. It's October 1st. And if you want to receive an application, there is the email address for you to, you need to send a little request there, and they'll respond back with the application. And sort of like I outlined earlier, you had to have participated in the bulk order. You had to have paid Region 4 your local share already. And then you would have had to have received CRF funding from your city or county. So if those three things apply to you, then you can submit this application to TEA and then draw down that TEA match for your city and county contribution. And I know in some presentations we've talked about the sort of prospects of another stimulus. Unfortunately, those prospects seem to be dimming. And just real quickly, we'll kind of go through the latest developments there. So first, we had the Democrats passing their proposal called the HEROES Act out of the House. You can see schools would have received around $58 billion of that. Then the Senate Republicans proposed their HEALS Act. and that included about $70 billion for K-12 schools and public and private schools, and about 2/3 of that would be sort of conditional on reopening your campuses for in-person learning. Then after sort of some negotiations, that Senate Republicans sort of scaled that down to what was called a Skinny Heels Act. On the 10th, that failed to secure enough votes to move forward. That's essentially dead right now. And we just thought this sort of illustrated it, sort of the prospects of another stimulus pretty well. This is a poll of education advocates and lobbyists at the federal level, and it's done at least every month, I believe. And you can see that here on August 18th, everyone, sort of the federal watchers, were all very hopeful that another stimulus would pass by the end of September. On September 10th, when that vote in the Senate failed, you can see just a very large drop off. And not to be overly negative about this, but I would imagine if this poll was taken today, given that DC is very much focused on getting through another Supreme Court nominee, I would imagine that that is going to suck up all the oxygen in the room, and prospects of another stimulus probably even lower before the election. So on that very good, happy note, I will pause, and if there's any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll hang around here for a couple minutes, and if we see anything drop in there, we'll try and address them as best we can. Thanks again for joining us, and yeah, good luck out there.
Yeah, and if you, as always, if you guys are TSPN members and you have other people who want to be receiving our weekly newsletters, feel free to email us at tspn@mokc.com to make sure that the right people are getting that correspondence.